Yeah. I'm pretty bad at this game if you can't tell. First Encounter Assault Recon, or F.E.A.R as it's abbreviated in the game's official title, is a first-person shooter action horror game that blends hot-blooded and heart-pumping action with pulse-pounding and eerie horror. When I think of games that have stuck with me from childhood, I think of this game first, and another more controversial title, Silent Hill 4. I have distinct memories of playing these two games as a child, although I know some of those memories are wrong because I used to think F.E.A.R was on the original Xbox, but as it turns out, the game's assets were far too advanced for even the PS3 and Xbox 360 to handle. I played these games at my cousin's house, but I don't remember if he actually had a 360 or not at the time, which is why I call some of those memories into question. But one thing I do remember, without a doubt, is this sequence right here. As a young child with a still developing mind and mostly entirely ignorant of games like this, crap like this absolutely terrified me and kept me from continuing further. What's also funny is I distinctly remember loading up a save from this game at random, and I ended up playing through the final sequence of the game. I have a vivid memory of the line,
"I've tried to forget. I've tried so hard to forget."
as I tried to make my way through the burning complex and kept getting murdered by the scary ghost lady's lethal hug attack. After I moved away and stopped seeing my cousin, I never really tried to play this game again. It had left an impact on me, and I always associated it with horror games in general, but I never sought it out, even though as I got older, I became increasingly interested in actually playing it. I'd watched walkthroughs and compilations of all the scary moments in the game, but nothing compared to when I finally got another chance to play this game after borrowing a friend's PlayStation 3 who happened to have a copy. This playthrough I never actually finished, but it cemented my love for this game, as I had just discovered the greatest FPS game of all time. First things first, while I do think the gameplay in this is exceptional, top of the line even, it's not the main appeal of the game for me. I see it more as a vehicle to get to and from each area. After all, you have to play a game in order to experience it, and unlike most people, what sticks with me more than anything else is the horror and the story. Still, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the actual gameplay and the mechanics of the game, so let's get into it. F.E.A.R does a lot of things differently than most modern shooters. It uses an over-the-shoulder style of aiming, and the kickback on most of the weapons is tremendous, making them extremely inaccurate, especially in the heat of a gunfight if you don't know what you're doing. These little quirks of the gunplay, along with the insane accuracy of the AI, even on lower difficulties, is likely to compensate for the slow motion mechanic, or reflex mode. When you activate it, you basically slow down time around you, and it's a mechanic you're likely to rely on, even on repeat playthroughs once you do know what you're doing. Seriously, the AI in this game is insane with how good and tough to beat they are. F.E.A.R veterans can run through the game without so much as glancing the reflex mode's way, but I am not one of those players, if the footage you're watching isn't indicative enough of that fact. None of these things are knocks against the game, however. The imprecise aiming and dead eye of the enemies throughout the game serve to keep the game tense no matter the situation, especially if you're not careful and have to go into the next gunfight with next to no healing. It's all very well crafted, and the game gives you every tool you need to fight back, so it's not as if the challenge is unfairly skewed in the computer's favor. Like I mentioned, reflex mode evens the odds significantly, and you'll likely be relying on it an awful lot to get through most encounters like I do. But there is another system that can help keep you one step ahead of the replica soldiers and the ATC security ops. Everything they do is pronounced, like a boss that telegraphs its attacks so you can learn the way it fights and how to counteract it to gain an edge. The AI of F.E.A.R are scripted to communicate with each other and announce their battle tactics. What this means is that as long as you're listening and paying attention, you can always stay several steps ahead of the enemy. Know when you're in danger and need to get out of dodge, or when it's time to push through and take out what's left. They even have different responses depending on the state of the battle. Soldiers will respond to commands as you'd expect if their numbers are good, but when you thin them out and the odds start to even, they'll actively tell whoever is giving them orders off and do their own thing. This is because the way the AI are scripted has them set to constantly attempt to fulfill a goal. This AI system is called GOAP, or Goal-Oriented Action Planning. And while I won't get into the specifics here, I'll link a video in the description that does exactly that. To briefly cover it though, AI in F.E.A.R are scripted to fulfill certain goals dependent on the situation, their highest priority goal being to stay alive. This keeps the AI from doing dumb shit you would normally see it do in other games, so you're not going to see them run straight into a thrown grenade because you happen to be on the other side of it. Once that condition is fulfilled is when they'll start to attack you. Basically, if an enemy in F.E.A.R has the choice of whether to pursue you or fulfill a goal that keeps them alive, such as ducking under cover or dodging a grenade, they will always fulfill the latter option first, and then resume the former once the condition has been satisfied. This is helped by the simplistic level design, which will typically resemble what you'd expect from a multiplayer map, giving plenty of opportunity to outmaneuver your target or avoid incoming fire. The number of interactable objects in the locations are also limited to prevent the AI from making dumb moves to try and protect themselves, like running over to a table you happen to be in front of to flip it over for cover. Because of these things, F.E.A.R's AI is able to behave and act dynamically, making each playthrough different and unique, contributing massively to the game's replayability. To address what I said a moment ago about the AI being scripted to communicate, that's not actually what's going on. The AI don't move depending on the words spoken. It's more like the reverse. The AI decides to make a move, and the game will play a set line in accordance with the action that's being taken. This helps to keep gunfights from becoming overwhelming, confusing, or downright frustrating. To sum it all up, a combination of well-programmed AI and level design keep combat dynamic, fresh, and engaging. You'll always have a new experience with each combat encounter, and there's never a correct way to approach a battle, except for maybe a few specific sections. Some of the early battle arenas aren't that great. But moving on, I'm not going to spend too much time discussing the artillery, but suffice to say there's a pretty decent loadout here to work with. Single or dual handguns, several machine guns, my personal weapon of choice, the shotgun, a nail gun, snipers, rockets, or energy weapons that instantly liquefy enemies. You can hold up to 3 firearms at a time, along with several types of grenades and up to 10 healing packs at a time.
Admittedly, it is sort of annoying having to decide what weapons to keep and which to dispose of, especially on repeat playthroughs when you're likely attempting more stylish play. For instance, the first weapons I tend to dispose of are the handguns, even though I really enjoy using them and they come the closest to invoking the feel of a cheesy action set piece. But especially in later levels when you have giant mechs blasting rockets at you, you have to dispose of the least useful weapons first. So that's something of a bummer and a bit of a low point for me, but for a game with so many highs already, it's a relatively small issue. I think that's about all I have to say on the gameplay. There's other enemy types and melee attacks are at your disposal, but for the most part I covered the important beats that I wanted to, so we're gonna move on to the story.
To be honest, there really isn't much to F.E.A.R's story in the surface. The intro gives us everything we need, and not much more. We get a little flavor text establishing the context behind the game's title. We learn what F.E.A.R is and why it exists. It's an anti-supernatural task force dedicated to combating paranormal threats that threaten the nation. This is the task force your character, the Point Man, has been assigned to. Your objective being to capture and eliminate this man, Paxton Fettel, a psychic who's taken control over a large group of clone soldiers who only respond to psychic commands. There's also a scary little girl in a red dress that seems to be connected to the events of the story in some way, and especially to Paxton. How exactly isn't really explained until the very end of the game in the final chapter. There are little pre-level text screens before the start of each level that convey the general premise of where the story is and what your objective is, which most of the time is just find Paxton Fettel. Like I said, on the surface there's not really much going on with F.E.A.R's story. It's a simple search and destroy operation with some supernatural elements mixed in for flavor. It gives you everything you need to get from place to place to experience its phenomenal gameplay, and for most people that's certainly enough. Even I, the guy who said at the beginning of the video that the story and horror is what sticks with me the most, can get lost in the gunfights and constant struggle for survival. But there's definitely something there, something scratching away beneath the surface. I've seen some people say that the reason F.E.A.R's story is so obscure within its own game is because the devs knew they didn't have much of a story to tell, but I disagree. Everything you could want from a sci-fi thriller is here. Government conspiracy, shadow ops, illegal experimentation, cover-up operations, and turncoats are all present here and then some. In terms of how the story affects the gameplay, it's true that there isn't much going on. The game is consistent with how it plays regardless of the objective or where you happen to be. All that really changes is the context, but that doesn't mean there isn't a story, just that it doesn't impose upon the gameplay much. I'll do a summary of the story, and spoilers will be included, so just skip ahead if that bothers you for an 18-year-old game. The story centers around Alma Wade. You may be the protagonist, but I would say Alma is the main character of the game and the subsequent titles. She was born with telepathic abilities and eventually started being experimented on by her own father and Armacam Technology Corporation at the ripe young age of 3. Yep, Alma's own father introduced her to secret and inhumane government experimentation when she was likely still learning how to use a damn toilet. She passed every test they conducted, which only ended up making her life that much shittier. Alma's life was already pretty fucked. For some reason, her psychic abilities made her sensitive to the negative emotions and thoughts of others, so they experimented on her endlessly until she became too dangerous to control, at which point they locked her in a vault and created Project Origin in order to find a way to use her genetics to create psychics without her emotional traumas. To accomplish this, she was artificially inseminated. Twice. The first child she gave birth to was when she was 15, and it was you, the Point Man. You are Alma's firstborn son, which was why you have the reflex mode in the game. You were born with superior genetic advancements that gave the Point Man insane reflexes, but as it was deemed a failure, Alma was impregnated again and forced to give birth to a second child. Paxton Fettel. This would be the final straw, as while Paxton seemed to be everything they had hoped for, something happened. Even though Alma was forcibly put into a coma, her powerful abilities allowed her to telepathically connect with Paxton, triggering what would come to be known as the first synchronicity event.
I figured out what a synchronicity event is. There was an incident where they lost control of Fettel. He just suddenly started freaking out. He was only about 10 years old at the time, but I guess he killed a few people. In the investigation, they discovered that there had been a telepathic link between Fettel and Alma, even though she was in a coma. They concluded that she was influencing him. That must have been why they pulled the plug on Origin.
This would cause a 10-year-old Paxton to freak out and kill 7 people. This event is what led to the researchers working on Origin to finally pull the plug and leave Alma to die, cutting off her life support and praying. Well, it worked, but in the most rudimentary way. Alma's body died, but her mind lived on, and so did her hatred. The district these experiments took place on were abandoned, the facilities locked down, and eventually the entire Auburn district was evacuated and left to decay. Though everything seemed to have been left to rot and die, something happened that would reignite interest in the remnants of Project Origin and those responsible for the cruelty that befell Alma. Enter this bitch. Genevieve Aristide, who may very well be the true villain of this entire story. Sure, Alma was a raging monster unleashing fire and demons wherever she happened to be, and Paxton Fettel was a literal cannibal, but Genevieve would become the catalyst that allows every tragedy that takes place before and after the events of the first game to take place. So, this woman, in all her wisdom, decided that the facility where the psychologically traumatized psychic woman died was ripe for inspection and relaunch. So she sent in a whole team of people to investigate and determine the viability of the facility, and then she lost contact with each one of them. So, what did she do after that? Send in another squad to assess the viability of the facility, and, I assume, search for the missing unit. But then, you want to guess what happened next? You want to just take a guess? She lost contact with them too. Shocking, I know. After that, the conditions that caused the Auburn district to be evacuated and abandoned intensified, and Genevieve was forced to admit she made a mistake and closed the facility again. But it was too late, and a second synchronicity event took place. Seeing as Alma was reawakened, she connected to Paxton again, and he took control of all the clone soldiers the military had been developing and turned them to Alma's side. This is the sequence of events we see in the intro, and leads us into the events of the game. Everything I've just explained so far is lore. Backstory contextualizing what you'll be experiencing throughout the game. Like Like I said before, at this point most of the game's story is fairly obscure. Blink and you'll miss it. If you're not looking for it, you can easily miss it from this point. The opening and intro mission does a good job setting up what you'll be doing for most of the game, which is hunting down Paxton and disabling the clone soldiers he's controlling. Most of the additional context I've included on the previous section is stuff you can miss. It's only alluded to in the main story and is hidden across the levels in the form of voicemails and laptops. The early voicemails don't really explain much, and it isn't until you get to the ATC headquarters that they become really interesting. The laptops as well mention things that don't seem particularly relevant at first until you start digging deeper and getting to the ones later in the game. But by the time you get to the end, you'll likely have a pretty clear picture of what went on behind the scenes at the facility and Project Origin. Alma goes from this creepy and unknowable figure with unclear motives to a deeply sympathetic character you can't help but feel bad for in regards to everything she went through, but also have no choice but to destroy her, perfectly embodied in a scene near the end of the game where Alma attempts to hug you, having just discovered that you are her son. But you have to shoot her and keep her at bay because her touch is lethal and will instantly kill you if she gets too close. It's the only time in the game Alma has the ability to actually kill the player, and it's done in the most sad and heartbreaking way possible. It's a perfect example of using gameplay to enhance the story, and I'm honestly surprised more people don't talk about it. F.E.A.R was ahead of its time in more ways than just its gameplay and the incredible use of its AI. Onto the story itself though, there really isn't much to go through level to level. As I've been saying, most missions are just find Paxton Fettel and serve to take us from action sequence to action sequence. The exceptions to this are the first level and the last one. The first level establishes the mood. You're the new guy, and you're being put on point to track down Paxton. Fettel's last recorded location via a tracker implanted in his body leads the team to a warehouse in the Auburn district where you encounter some early spooks and have your first confrontation with Paxton himself, where he explains that
He deserved to die. They all deserve to die.
this is in reference to a body you find just before meeting up with Paxton, and tells you that there is indeed some sort of pattern to all of this. Paxton isn't going around thoughtlessly killing whoever he sees. This is an organized attack with a purpose behind it, and he seems to be looking for something, or someone. He mentions a nondescript her in his ramblings to the point man before you pass out and reconvene with your team, where you're quickly moved to the next location. It's at this point we see a little of what Jankowski was talking about at the beginning of the game.
This is why nobody takes us seriously. Military clones.
You're on point. See if you can get this gate open. I'd send one of my boys, but I think we need a specialist for this one.
It's not a very heavily emphasized point, but I like that it's there. It's a little detail that helps flesh out the world of F.E.A.R a bit more. People don't take your team seriously. It seems to be a supernatural task force in a world where the supernatural is about as common as it is in ours, which really makes everything that happens from this point on all the more horrifying. This marks the first encounter with Alma as she annihilates the team that was sent in along with you, and not too long after you have your first direct confrontation with her, which forces the point man to escape via the window. After that, you basically just fight your way through the rest of the area until you reach an evac point to make your way to Armacam HQ. A recon team goes missing there, making this the third one, I think, and your objective becomes to find them for a while. Now, Armacam HQ is where things like the phone messages and laptops start getting really juicy. Each one becomes a point of interest if you're looking to learn more about the world and what's actually going on around you, while you're fighting through clone armies and being spooked by a creepy ghost girl.
This is interesting. When they pulled the plug on Origin, apparently they just locked the doors and threw away the key. They don't go into a lot of detail, but I guess the place is really dangerous to be in. What if there's some kind of chemical leak or something? There's a little more here about Origin. The reason they shut it down was a synchronicity event. Doesn't say what that means, but I guess there were a few casualties.
Chuck Habiger. It's Chuck Habiger. I've analyzed the readings and I've recommended we suspend Perseus till we can figure out what's causing the synchronization. The patterns are identical to what we saw last time, but obviously the consequences would be a hell of a lot worse.
Hi, it's Marshall. Just got off the phone with Chuck Habiger. Really worried about his findings. He said he talked to you about suspending the program temporarily, and I've got to agree. If there's even the slightest chance of another synchronicity event, we've got to take it seriously. I'm gonna head over to the Perseus compound and check things out myself. Why don't you give me a call to my cell? Let's discuss this.
Plot-wise, things remain relatively consistent until you run into this guy. This man is Norton Mapes, and as you may have guessed from his goofy-ass name, he's this game's attempt at comic relief. Now, I'm not against comedy and horror, but honestly, this guy just doesn't do it for me. The experience is lessened by his presence. I would have preferred there to be no comedic relief at all than to have him be here. He's just a giant sleazy nuisance and the butt end of a fat joke later. He has a little redeeming moment by the end of the game as you enter the vault, but it's not really enough to justify his presence in the game, I think, especially when you get to the expansions and he's up to his old tricks. He also unleashes the turrets that attack you throughout a chunk of the facility, and like, I hate the turrets. So, Norton has an important role to play in the story and is, sadly, one of the most prominent side characters. You run into him multiple times and he even makes it to the end game. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. He tricks us into disabling the security system so he can run away and be a pain in the ass later down the line. So you reboot the system yourself and, well, you find the missing team. They look like they've had a great time. You can tell Alma was more than hospitable with them.
What do you think, Jen?
There was a lot of anger in this room.
That's great. Got anything useful to add?
I don't see any bullet holes. There's no brass lying around either. These guys didn't fire a shot.
Then what killed them?
I don't know.
Well, figure it out. All right, buddy, get moving. Battle's gotta be close.
So your primary objective once again becomes hunting down Paxton, and you shoot your way through ATC HQ, and eventually you can come across a message from the GOAT.
Harlan Wade. Mike, it's Harlan Wade. Chuck Habiger seems to think the people are blowing smoke up his ass on this Perseus situation. Now, I don't know which one of you shitheels over there is calling the shots, but you'd better stop digging around fast, because the readings are getting worse by the minute. It's really a simple choice. You can either listen to the expert advice you're being given, or you can brace yourselves for the ass fuck of the century, because it's coming. You mark my words on that.
Harlan Wade was the head researcher at ATC and the one who founded the projects Alma was subjected to. While the things he does are reprehensible and completely devoid of compassion and empathy, I can't help but get a little excited whenever he shows up in the messages or in the game itself, but I won't dwell on Harlan too much just yet. You fight your way through the building again, tearing through the replica forces until you eventually run into...
Oh, it's you. Christ, I thought I was a goner.
Mr. Mapes, you're still alive.
No thanks to you guys. Oh, perfect. You again. See this button? I wonder what this does.
I fucking hate this guy so much. After that, you run through what I can only assume is the science division of the labs, where they eventually send a giant mech after you, which I honestly can't stand because it just forces you to duck and fire thanks to their lack of knockback and insane accuracy. And the rockets have AoE. You're basically just playing any other shooter when these things show up, and it isn't fun, it's frustrating. So there's a knock against the game after all the high praise I've been giving it so far. After that, you do some more sneaking around on your way to intercept F.E.A.R, until you eventually are provided with a turret section. Fun fact, it's fairly difficult, but you can take out the entire battalion here if you're careful. So you work your way through all of that, and then you get to what I believe is the first phone message from...
Genevieve Aristide. Ian, can you send me copies of any materials your task force has put together on the origin anomalies? Harlan is supposed to be updating me daily, but apparently he's got his hands full with the grudge he insists on carrying. I hope he's not dribbling too much poison in people's ears. I take full responsibility for what happened to the team, but wishing won't bring them back. In any case, now's not the time for assigning blame. We have to work together as a team to get through this crisis. Thanks so much.
Oh yeah, it's not the time for assigning blame because it's your fault it happened. I'm sure you'd be acting exactly the same way if anybody else was trying to shift blame when they caused a problem. So now you run through the area and very quickly come across Paxton, who delivers a rather ominous and scarily accurate prediction.
A war is coming. I've seen it in my dreams. Fire sweeping over the earth, bodies in the streets, cities turned to dust. Retaliation.
Then you battle your way deeper and deeper into ATC headquarters, sending another small legion of replicas their early retirement packages along with another... Then you'll soon stumble across another message from him, and it's just as glorious as the last one.
Hi, it's Harlan Wade. I've been trying to get a hold of Genevieve all week, but the bitch never picks up her fucking phone. Now look, if you see her, tell her we're in deeper shit than I thought. Her brilliant idea of reopening the vault set something in motion that I can't explain, and I don't know how to stop. I sure hope she's happy.
I'm sorry, I just find Harlan's complete lack of tact an absolute beauty to behold.
Tact is just not saying true stuff. I'll pass.
Listen to this. Marshall Disler, Bill Mooney, and Aldous Bishop are all working on some kind of task force together. The other members are Ian Hayes, Alice Wade, Norton Mapes, and Charles Habiger. And Harlan Wade is the one pulling the strings. I guess that means Fettle's working his way up the food chain.
There you go. Now we know what Fettle's doing. He's specifically hunting down members of the research team that worked on Project Origin, and it won't be long before we figure out why. Until then, though, we meet up with the next member of the research team, Alice Wade, daughter to head researcher Harlan Wade, and certified helicopter phobe. But, I honestly don't understand why she would be afraid of flying. The F.E.A.R team assures her the helicopter is safe, and honestly, it's probably the best option to escape. Okay, yeah, no, I kinda get it now. So Alice runs off and you have to pursue her, and you encounter the actual worst enemies in the game, along with a conversation between a Phil, Harlan, and Genevieve.
How are you? It's Genevieve. I haven't seen you at Maurice's lately. We should get together for happy hour once this mess blows over. Speaking of which, I have a favor to ask. I know you and Harlan go back a ways, so I was hoping you could try to reason with him. He refuses to forgive me for sending those poor people into the vault, as though I'm happy about what happened. I made a mistake, but I don't see why everyone else should have to pay for that. Anything you can say to get him to see reason would be appreciated. Hi, it's Genevieve. I just want to remind you that the Origin facility was a liability long before this situation erupted. I was simply trying to clean up an old mess. I was hoping we could renovate or even repurpose the site, but clearly the risks are unacceptable. I see no alternative but to destroy it completely. If you have a better suggestion, I'd love to hear it. In the meantime, I have a company to save.
Harlan, you're right. The crazy bitch is determined to blow the site to kingdom come. God knows who she thinks is gonna pick up the pieces when her plan backfires. I've had enough of this shit. I plan to be sipping girly drinks on a beach in Tahiti by the time the media gets wind of all this. Talk to you later, buddy. Here, I got your message. First off, please don't presume to know my feelings. It's insulting. And don't lecture me about burying the dead like some fuckwit shrink. The bottom line is that we wouldn't be in this situation if you didn't ignore my warnings. And now you want to dig the hole deeper. Sooner or later, you're gonna dig right down to hell.
Once again, Harlan proving to be the absolute alpha of the game, and Genevieve making excuses and trying to save herself and nobody else. I seriously hate this woman, and she wasn't even involved in Project Origin to my knowledge. Your path eventually takes you to what I consider the worst section of the entire game. There's very little in the way of cover and maneuverable environments, and there's an armored guy. Your only option is to literally hide behind a wall, poke your head out, and take pot shots until they all die. It's super disappointing, but thankfully it doesn't last terribly long. Getting past it, you're taken to the final section of the game, the secret research facility. You fight your way through a warehouse and an abandoned hotel complex. Not a lot happens here. You're just trying to close the distance between yourself and Paxton, who you assume has Alice Wade by this point. Eventually, you work your way into the secret facility where the game begins its wrapping up phase. You have to deal with ATC security who are trying to keep you from discovering the truth, as well as more replica soldiers trying to stop you from intercepting Paxton. All the while, Harlan is making his way to the site to unleash something big, and Norton Mapes is trying to erase evidence of everything under orders from Genevieve. Unfortunately, Harlan isn't trying to stop things anymore and does the most based thing in this entire game.
My job, and I'm doing what has to be done.
Mapes tells you Harlan has locked you out of the vault and the only way in is to swap the power converters to the door to get it open. So you go ahead and do that, meeting some more resistance along the way, where you discover one of the most significant pieces of the puzzle.
It's starting to make sense. The name of the woman they used for Origin is Alma. That's who Fed was looking for. Oh, Jesus. He was just a kid. Says here Alma was 8 years old when Origin started up. They used a little girl. No wonder they're so fucking anxious to keep a lid on this mess. Somebody's gonna burn for this.
Just like that, everything suddenly makes sense. The creepy girl that's been stalking you throughout the game, she's the subject of the experiments ATC is trying to cover up. A powerful psychic the researchers tortured in every way imaginable in the name of science, and then when she became more trouble than she was worth, they moved on and put her in cryosleep, keeping her alive so they could use her to give birth to potential successors, you and Paxton. But once she connected with Paxton and he killed several people, they pulled the plugs, tossed the key, and hoped she would die on her own. They tried to bury their sins, and now they'll burn for it. Genevieve makes one last attempt to plead with Harlan to save her own skin.
Harlan, it's Genevieve. Listen, I understand your feelings, I really do. But this is no time for sentimentality. If Origin is uncovered, every single one of us will burn for it. It's time we buried the dead, don't you think? Harlan, it's me again. If you want an apology, then I apologize. I was wrong. You were right. In any case, I want to be sympathetic, but the situation is urgent. I'm sending Mapes to take care of things since you seem reluctant to do what needs to be done. I hope you can find it in yourself to assist him.
Norton makes one last plea with you as you prepare to enter the vault and confront Harlan.
You have to destroy this facility before he lets her out. There are 4 pylons. Damage the reactor cells, and you'll trigger a chain reaction. Blow the whole place to hell, where it belongs. If he lets Alma out, you have to stop him.
You enter the room, activate the lift, and descend to the next interval, Revelation. You catch a glimpse of Harlan staring off at something, and engage in your last confrontation with Paxton, who reveals the truth you've likely uncovered by this point in the story. You two are brothers, and Alma is your mother. After that, you fulfill your primary objective. With Paxton dead, the replica soldiers are now offline, and you're free to tie up the remaining loose end.
She was a very disturbed child. Terrible, debilitating nightmares, hallucinations, hysteria. She never had a chance at a normal life. It was Dissler who realized she was telepathic. He speculated that she was extremely sensitive to the negative emotions of people around her. We removed her from that chamber only twice. She was 15 when the first prototype was born. She was supposed to be comatose, but she started screaming when we induced labor and didn't stop until the liquid filled her lungs. There are plausible scientific explanations for everything that followed, but I think it was really just a question of hatred. It is the way of men to make monsters, and it is the nature of monsters to destroy their makers.
This is something I think a lot of fans forget about Harlan. It's been often speculated that the measure of a person's character comes in what they choose to do in their final moments on Earth. Harlan subjected his daughter to inhumane research experiments and subjected her to a life of pain, though due to the unfortunate nature of her telepathy, she was already destined for that. But his last act was to make it up to her in some small way, the only way he could think of, finally letting her free from her confinement. Of course it's too late. The damage has already been done, and Alma makes it abundantly clear that nothing is forgiven, but he had to know that was going to be the outcome. He says it himself. He went into that knowing he was going to die. He just wanted to do one thing for her. He chose to be a father in his last act rather than a scientist, and I think that says something. Even F.E.A.R 2 tries to portray him as sympathetic by actively refusing to put Alma back in the vault, but eventually giving in. Something that F.E.A.R 3 completely forgot about when they chose to make him completely black-hearted.
This is how it ends.
So now Alma is free, and the remainder of the game is story-focused, since there's no replicas left to fight. It's fairly tense. Now that she's free, demons from her mind are being unleashed all over the facility, as you destroy the pylons and activate the self-destruct sequence. You work your way back up through the complex until you reach the exit, and an atomic bomb or maybe a nuke goes off. You're picked up just in time, and all seems to be well.
What about Alma? What happened to her? What was that sound?
And that was F.E.A.R's story. Much like its expansions, it ends on a rather gloomy note. There's no hope to be found in it, and maybe I'll cover its expansions and direct sequels someday. But for now, that's the story of First Encounter Assault Recon. I wish I could pinpoint why I enjoy the world and lore of F.E.A.R so much, but I really can't. Alma is my favorite example of the creepy girl trope, and I would absolutely go to war arguing she would slaughter any other example you can give me. Harlan is surprisingly complex once you dig into his interactions with the other characters, and Genevieve is as slimy as they come. Paxton is enjoyable throughout, and the devs seem to know that too, given he comes back in every subsequent title. One last thing I want to touch on is the game's presentation. The game is absolutely stunning to look at even now, some 18 years later. So much that I doubt any of you noticed that during the third half of the game I was playing with a mod that uses AI technology to upscale and enhance the graphical quality of the game. Truly the only thing about F.E.A.R's stunning visual quality that's aged is the character models. The atmosphere is suitably dark and leaves you on edge most of the time with its dim and dynamic lighting. I'm using a reshader that gives the game HDR lighting to further enhance that effect. Both of these will be linked below if you want to try them out for yourself. With all of that said, I think that's everything I wanted to say about F.E.A.R. It's a great game, and I think at least its first sequel is worth playing, but F.E.A.R 3 is definitely overhated, since all it really does is go back to its action roots and tones down the horror, while F.E.A.R 2 did the opposite. Thank you guys for watching, and I apologize this video took so long to make. My motivation comes and goes, and the last chunk of the script didn't even get written until about a day or so before this video uploads. I hope to see you all again next time.